Please make sure your computer speakers are muted. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the FEMA Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness webinar series. My name is Allison Albright and I'm the Regional Preparedness Liaison for FEMA Region 2. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the FEMA website in the coming weeks. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure your volume is turned up so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right corner, we ask if you'd like to receive news and updates from Region 2. If so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You'll see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter there, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation from today will be available for you to download in the file share pod as a PDF. You can click on the file and download it using the download button. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the Region 2 Community Preparedness Officer to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Thanks, Allison. You know that FEMA's #1 goal in our strategic plan is to build a culture of preparedness. The Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Program is focused on preparing individuals and communities for disasters by providing useful information and training, inspiring people to act and be ready for any emergency. Good afternoon. I'm Debbie Costa, the Community Preparedness Officer for FEMA Region 2. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'd like to welcome you to our Preparedness webinar series. As part of that goal, we're pleased to be hosting today's Guides to Expanding Mitigation webinar, a series about how to expand the reach of mitigation activities by engaging more people and organizations from across the whole community beyond those typically involved in hazard mitigation. Today's guide is Municipal Financing. Partnering with local financial professionals is essential to help communities make hazard mitigation plans a reality. In this webinar, you'll learn about key funding sources and how to incorporate mitigation projects into longer-term community budgets. Our subject matter expert today is John Miller. He is the FEMA Region 2 Mitigation Liaison to the state of New Jersey. He is a member of the FEMA Integration Team, embedded with the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management, to be a risk adaptation resource to the state and enhance coordination between the agencies. Previously, he worked for the private consultancy Princeton Hydro, LLC, for 15 years as an associate and water resource engineer, performing design, conducting reviews, and preparing expert reports and delivering expert testimony before land use boards and the courts. John, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, and welcome everyone to this presentation. Our agenda for this webinar, we are going to share the background on why these series of guides to expanding mitigation were created. We're going to provide details and examples for municipal financing and funding. We're going to answer any questions you may have about this particular guide, and then we'll feature future webinars on additional guides. So mitigation involves the whole community. It's time to expand our reach to that entire community, and our partners in community lifelines, as well as non-traditional partners in the arts and other sectors, can help us bring hazard mitigation to life and normalize it by linking it to everyday concerns. The value of engaging new partners in reducing risk cannot be overstated. So looking at these lifelines, the lifelines also encourage whole community engagement. The National Mitigation Investment Strategy encourages the whole community, including individuals, to invest in mitigation pre- and post-disaster by adopting the investment strategy's 3 shared goals. Supporting recommendations focus specifically on how the federal government and non-federal partners can identify, support, influence, and align whole community mitigation investments. When we think about the whole community, we can start with its most critical assets, or community lifelines, as you see in the slide. Mitigation projects that emphasize community lifelines should be grounded in a comprehensive approach to planning. The goals and objectives of FEMA's strategic plan promote using mitigation to reduce risk to the lifelines before a disaster and to quickly stabilize a community after disaster by preventing cascading impact. So we're going to look at one guide, but there's a series of guides intended to engage sectors that may not be actively involved in the mitigation planning process currently. So there's 10 sectors covered in the guides, a series of guides, and they have important roles to play in mitigation planning and risk reduction activities within their communities. So you can see these guides. There's one for agriculture, arts and culture, communication systems, electric power, equity, municipal financing that we'll be going over today, public health, transportation, the whole community, and the zombie apocalypse. And you should tune in for that one. So the guides will reach people when FEMA engages with communities during risk map or plan review in newsletters, during webinars, or at conferences. The brochures will also be distributed to stakeholders through a promotion plan that includes social media materials and a guide to best practices for using social media. So within each guide, you can expect to find insights into role sector plays, into the role the sector plays in the community, potential vulnerabilities of each sector to hazards, engagement recommendations, resources, and data to use for activities, ideas for how the sector can support risk reduction planning and projects, and successful collaboration. So the guides are helpful references because they provide new ideas on sectors that may be partners and allies for FEMA's efforts to create a culture of preparedness. They help to expand the number and type of organizations and sectors in your community who are involved in mitigation planning and implementation, increasing efficiency and bandwidth. They increase the quality of mitigation plans and projects by making them more representative of the whole community, its inhabitants, and businesses. Further, they encourage efficient and creative project ideation to better meet the many needs and interests of communities. And finally, they provide potential funding streams and other useful resources. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's webinar, is municipal funding and finding. So as communities advance through the hazard mitigation planning process, exploring options that will reduce their risks, it's critical to identify how these efforts will be funded. Creating a funding strategy from multiple diverse sources will help to secure the resources necessary to keep your community safe from future disasters. Local financial professionals, whether the business administrator or financial officer in your community, can help communities explore creative public and private funding sources. These are the experts in your community that know how to realize a project. So collaboration and partnership with finance professionals is central to the mitigation planning process. They can help you identify funding sources to make hazard mitigation plans and projects a reality. Together, you can explore a variety of funding sources, including federal and state grants, state revolving loan programs, or bonds. Working closely with your local financial professional offers many benefits. Involving them early in your planning process can help you ensure your community has a solid funding strategy to implement the hazard mitigation projects. Local finance professionals' deep understanding and connection to the community's financial landscape can be a tremendous asset to mitigation projects. Their insight and connections can advise you and help to incorporate the mitigation project into longer-term planning within the community budget or the capital improvement plan. Make you better positioned to pursue limited mitigation funding. Your case for enhancing community resilience will be stronger when the projects are built into the community's budget or the capital improvement plan. And finally, help you communicate with internal partners to share the value of preventative actions to keep the community safe, maintain operations, buttress revenues, and replace future. So a deeper look inside the Municipal Finance Guide. There are components within the guide, such as partnering for success, working with your community's finance professionals, core finance planning questions, community planning and accounting methods, funding mechanisms, and then there's resources at the end of the guide. Although these resources are, throughout these resources, you'll also see some specific information about the role this industry plays in our regional economy. So we do have an example. We have a couple examples in the guide, and the one is related to Granite Falls, Minnesota, where they used local tax increment financing and private investment. So to implement its mitigation strategy, the city of Granite Falls, Minnesota identified 10 local, state, and federal sources of funding for their mitigation projects across the city. Granite Falls used local tax increment financing and private investment for some mitigation projects. From state and federal from federal and state sources, it received nearly $38 million over 2 decades. And the city used those funds to reduce risk to residential, commercial, and governmental structures and create a flood wall. They also bought and demolished at-risk structures, and they did much more than that. So with that brief introduction to municipal funding and finance, the role of a local financial professional in your municipality to think about ways of funding mitigation projects, we wanted to hear from you on some thoughts you have and some questions you have in terms of how this guide works with your mitigation planning efforts in your community. So you're welcome to share any thoughts you have or takeaways in the chat. Do you have any thoughts on what type of grants are out there, how you might match those grants with specific funding, whether it's federal or state funding? These are the kind of conversations you want to have. And if your municipality, your community has a capital improvement plan, that might be a place that you add future projects, ones that you're not doing this year, but you might have a 10-year capital improvement plan where you want to have projects in there. Really getting those projects advanced would mean that you look at how you're going to fund those projects. What are you going to do? Are you going to bond for them? Are you going to fund those? Are you going for grants? Are you going for some other type of more creative type of funding mechanism? Those type of things. So we're looking for your comments on any of these possibilities. So some of these thoughts that we have from the guide, and I see some people asking questions, but one of the takeaways here, again, like all of the guides, is you're going to integrate your discussions with the financial professional in your community into that hazard mitigation planning process, so that you're not just talking about, hey, we want to do something, but you're actually matching that with how are we going to fund that? How are we going to actually realize that type of project, whether you're doing some kind of non-structural, elevating homes, are you buying out some homes, are you building some kind of infrastructure project, are you relocating certain areas or certain critical facilities, all those things. It's helpful to have those detailed discussions with financial professionals. So I'm getting some questions here.
John, I'm sorry. Want me to
Yeah.
help you moderate these questions a little bit?
That would be great. Thank you, Debbie.
Okay. Did you already talk about more specific types of community finance professionals who can inform mitigation projects?
Yeah, sure. Many towns have a financial professional, whether that's a business administrator. People recognize that title. A business administrator is someone who often will run the community. I mean, from a operational standpoint, not only with financial issues, but actually, oversee some of that local government. And then there's also financial officers that are more specific to just the finances. So the people you want to talk with is that business administrator, is that financial officer. And again, they will have a really solid understanding of the local budget. They will understand where, certain the debts the community has and the borrowing capacity, those type of things. So those are the people that you want to speak with.
Thanks, John. Can you tell us how will credit ratings affect communities most affected by climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So every community has a credit rating, and this is for your bonds. And it basically tells investors how likely are you to default on your debt. So credit ratings are based on the history of the town, of the community. It's based on the ability to repay what the town is borrowing. So if you have a good credit rating, just like your personal credit rating, like we all have credit ratings, that means that you can issue debt, you can borrow money with a low return to investors. If you have a very poor credit rating, that means that when you borrow, you have to offer incentives to those investors, and it requires additional money to borrow. You're paying back, or you're giving a return that's higher when you have a lower credit rating. So as you get into climate change and these risks, sea level rise and such, they can affect your credit rating and basically make it more expensive to borrow, because your tax base and your revenue into your community is going to be compromised by those threats.
Gotcha. Do you know how communities have been using this guide so far?
Well, the communities, and again, the guide is encouraging that conversation. My experience with hazard mitigation plans are that a community will list actions but not really back those up with some more detailed thinking about how they would realize those type of actions, those mitigation actions. So the guide is really to encourage that thinking. The city of Hoboken, New Jersey is one that has absolutely done this. And in the guide, it describes just how they incorporate it. Their mission to achieve resiliency into their financial considerations, whether that's the capital improvement plan and other type of things. So a good community to look at is Hoboken, New Jersey, in terms of what it did in planning for resiliency and considering the financial resources that were available.
Okay. What are some surprising things that you learned when doing the research for this particular project?
Gosh, we talked to a number of business administrators. We learned, that especially during this COVID period, we learned that their revenues were way down. We were talking to some with, 20 to 25% revenue loss, which, hopefully will be temporary, but we learned that, they were hit very hard by that. And how does that come into things? Well, that definitely is the stage that we're operating on in terms of advancing longer-term resiliency. And I was a little shocked at how the communities had been already affected by revenue reductions. We also learned, just talking to Hoboken, and we also have an example of with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and talking with them on when the state issued its hazard mitigation plan. They went right to the state officials that were working on the state's the capital budget, and they really specified on how would these things be funded, and looking ahead toward these projects and their realization, how would you pay for those things? So that was great to see not only a community do that, but also the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, a state, went in that direction and really provides a great example of doing this, which we're encouraging, which is, again, getting into the details, getting into the how, this project is something you need to do or you want to do, but how are you going to pay for it?
Gotcha. Hey, John, how can this guide help underserved and under-resourced communities?
So even communities that have challenges with both, planning efforts and, just competing in the grant cycle, you're going to have a better chance to compete. And in receiving grants, you have to manage those grants. You actually have, not just getting a grant and getting the money, but you getting, submitting reports, tracking contractors, doing different things. That requires a lot of work. So that's exactly the type of operation that is best accompanied with a financial professional. It's your business administrator. And even disadvantaged communities or underserved communities will have these professionals, and again, it's highly encouraged to link up with that professional in an early stage to make sure that not only can you accept this money, but you can actually manage that project. And again, looking at the creative ways of matching different sources of money is something that financial professional will help you with.
Thank you. Do any of the examples that you're aware of focus on affordable housing and equity aspects of long-term mitigation plans in the wake of a disaster?
Well, I think, certainly having a disaster can often free up resources. There are programs, both through FEMA, through HUD, and other agencies that become available out of the Stafford Act when a disaster is declared. And I think you could look at some of these housing needs and tailor the way that you're going to utilize that money. Now, that money comes into a state, You would want to work with your state partners, your state hazard mitigation officer. You would want to work with the agency that receives the HUD funding. But, and the best time to look at these things are actually before a disaster. The best time to get your thoughts together on actions you can take after disaster are before the disaster, and have those plans in place, have those thoughts together, engaging that financial expertise prior to the disaster, so you have a game plan when that money becomes available.
Okay. John, does the 202 hazard mitigation pre-disaster funding apply to this kind of funding allocation?
I think any type of available funding should be considered in these discussions. So you're looking at, again, and the financial professional will know some especially from a bonding standpoint, whether that's a good option. But I think any program should be part of the discussion and the creative process in coming up with ways that funding sources can be matched and blended to go into these types of implementation projects.
How would someone link mitigation to day-to-day concerns such as high poverty rate?
So I think that would be matched well with the lifelines approach. So if you go back to one of the earlier slides I showed, and looking at these critical community functions, and certainly one of those is food, and we have shelter issues and things like that that go into lifelines. But these are critical elements of a society that functions. And I think, again, looking at those lifelines, integrating in your planning efforts, and then again bringing in that financial component where you're looking to make those resilience changes. That's a successful way to go forward.
Okay. Can you elaborate more on how you work with the arts community?
Well, that is going to be the subject of a future webinar, and that is one of the guides in the series of 10 guides. And I would like to defer that to the future webinar on the arts.
Okay, that means Sanford, you need to join us again. And it's getting close to our time. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll close it out. Can I use hazard mitigation funding for preparedness and resilience programs like microforming, amateur radio, and CERT teams?
Well, once again, I think many actions a community can take require some kind of funding. I know CERTs are volunteers, but equipment and whether that's you're paying for that through grants, or you're having to purchase that as a community. But all of those activities and functions, they're usually matched in a line item on a budget. They might be, if it's a large enough thing, it might be, partly financed in some way. But again, it's kind of like all of these things that we do in building resilience and doing the planning and preparedness. Those are all possibilities of being creative with your financial professional in terms of how to fund those things.
Thank you, John. And thank you for your time today. We really appreciate you taking the opportunity to go over this particular guide to expanding mitigation. We're very excited to partner preparedness and mitigation together to deliver one webinar, Lunch and Learn series every month on the first Wednesday of each month at noon. You'll see the schedule is up on your screen right now. So in May, Sander, we expect you back, is the arts and culture, followed by public health, electric power, transportation, agriculture, the zombie apocalypse, communication systems, and codes and standards. So I hope that you will all join us again. There is a very short 3-question poll on the screen. If you wouldn't mind answering what you thought of today's webinar. It helps us to drive future programming. In the download pod is a PDF of today's presentation for you all to download if you'd like a copy of the slides. As usual, we are partnering with lots of wonderful subject matter experts on a variety of topics, everything from public assistance grants for houses of worship to community gardening, which I'm very excited, to how you can prevent child abuse. If you want to see any of our upcoming webinars, you can find them at the first link. Recordings of today's webinar and all previous webinars can be found at the second link. And if you don't already get Region 2 news from the Preparedness Division, click on subscribe there, and we'll get you added to our mailing list. We send out a bulletin every 2 weeks, and every week we send out the announcement of all our upcoming webinars. So again, thank you, John, and to all our participants, thank you for spending 30 minutes of your lunch break with us today. Everyone have a wonderful day. I think spring is finally coming. We're here. You're free to drop.